Is my PhD work experience? And I hear that question almost weekly in the work that I do with PhD students, postdocs, but also professors through the work at Alma Me. So, if you're a PhD and you're applying for industry jobs, chances are you have asked yourself that question at some point. And if you're honest, it may feel weirdly stressful. And because we don't want to get it wrong, because as PhDs, we tend to be very factual, right? So we neither want to oversell and exaggerate, but we also don't want to undersell ourselves. So, how can you go about that question? And this is something that I want to address in this video. So, if you're confused, this makes total sense. As PhDs, we are trained to think about PhD as education. So, of course, if you're now asked to reframe it as work experience, it may feel wrong. And so, if this has been on your mind, I just want to tell you in general, if this is a question you had in the past or that you're asking yourself right now, you're not alone. As I said, I almost hear this question weekly through the work that I do with the PhDs we're working with in our program. And here is the key thing most PhDs miss. The problem is not that we don't have work experience. The problem is more that we have the wrong definition of what work experience is. Because when industry talks about work experience, they're not actually asking, did she or did he work outside of academia? What they're really asking is, have you applied skills? Have you worked on real world problems? Have you produced outcomes? Have you dealt with uncertainty, feedback, and constraints? And also, have you collaborated with others and made this successful? That's it. So, work experience is about doing, not just learning. And once you see it in that way, things start to look very different. So, let's slow this down and let's look at what you're actually doing during a PhD. Because when you spell it out, it becomes very, very obvious. So at the start of a PhD, usually no one hands you a neat problem. So you go, you identify a gap, you search the literature, you understand what is known and what is missing and what actually matters. You define a question that is actually worth answering. And alone, this is a highly valuable skill. Next, you ask, how can I actually answer this question? How can I investigate this thing? Right? So you choose methods, you design experiments, you plan approaches, and you make decisions with incomplete information sometimes. In which direction should we move? And honestly, that's not theory, that's absolutely applied problem solving. And you know how it is? At some point, reality hits when things don't work. Your experiments fail and the data doesn't make any sense. Maybe your code breaks. So, what do? Right, you troubleshoot, you test alternatives, you adapt, you iterate. You don't just say, oh, well, you're going to figure it out. But honestly, guys, that's resilience and that's analytical thinking. And analytical thinking, resilient, those are real world skills. They're highly sought after in industry. And yeah, once you figured it out, you generate the results, but we don't stop here, right? You analyze the data. You look at what's the interpretation of the data. And then you decide what matters and what doesn't. And often we turn very messy outputs into data insights, to make informed decisions in which direction to move forward. And I mean, does that sound familiar to you? It should, because that's exactly what many industry roles require. And then there is one of my favorite skills, and is so often overlooked and yet so, so important. And it's communication, constant communication. You present at lab meetings, sometimes at department meetings. You explain your work to people who are not experts in your niche. You go to conferences where you give talks in front of the world experts. You answer questions. You make a poster. You visualize your science. You communicate your science. And you learn how to explain these ideas, these complex ideas clearly. And I want to tell you right away, this is a huge industry skill. Knowing how to communicate in a simplified way is golden. And we don't stop here, right? You write. I mean, you write up your results. You create drafts and revisions. You get feedback. You collaborate with co-authors on this. So you have to make this whole thing work, integrate the feedback that they give. And then you submit the papers. You deal with the reviewer comments, and which, let's be honest, can sometimes be really, really brutal. So, yeah, what do? You respond professionally, you defend decisions, and you revise again. And that's stakeholder management, whether you call it like this or not. So, at this point, let me ask you something. Does that sound like education, or does that sound like years of applied work? And once you look at it this way, the answer becomes very clear. Yes, my PhD is work experience. 100%. And you didn't just learn about things, you did things. As an actual matter of fact, you created new knowledge over and over again. So let's talk about where your PhD belongs in your CV/resume. Well, after this discussion, I think it should be pretty clear. It's under professional experience, not hidden, not minimized, not treated like a footnote, because it is professional experience. Again, you produced results, you solved problems, you managed projects, you collaborated, and you delivered outcomes over multiple years. All of that counts. It counts as experience. Now, where things can go wrong, actually, when you put it in the professional experiences, it's how it's described. Most PhDs write something like PhD in X or thesis on Y. And that tells industry most of the time nothing. Industry doesn't care about thesis titles. What they actually care about are things like what you actually did, what skills you applied, what problems you solved, what outcomes did you deliver. So stop focusing on what you studied and start focusing on what you did and the outcomes you achieved while doing the work. So industry is not looking for perfect academic alignment. They're looking for evidence that you can do the job. So you don't need to apologize for your background. I think that's really important. You don't need to downplay it. And you definitely don't need to start from scratch. All you need to do is reframe the experience and focus on outcomes. So let's answer the question one last time. Is my PhD work experience? And by now, I hope we all sit here and we agree. Yes, it absolutely is. Should it go under the professional experience in your CV/resume? Yes, absolutely, without a doubt. But frame it in the right way. That's important. So you're not behind, you're not doing it wrong, and you're not starting from zero. I hope this video was helpful and you've got this. If you have any questions, leave me some questions in the comments and I'm happy to answer or have a discussion.